Welcome back to 49cc Scoot. My name's Brent and this is the TPR 86cc build series. I know it's been quite a while now, but I'm finally going to get this engine back together and see if I can make the Lectron carburetor work a bit better for me. In the first couple of videos, I installed a 30mm high-velocity Lectron carburetor onto my 86cc two-stroke powered scooter, and I was trying to get it into a state of tune that works well for me. So I struggled a bit at the beginning, largely because I'm new to Lectron, I'm new to their metering rod technology, and I'm totally new to power jets as well. So it took a bit to just try to figure out how that process should go for me. But then even once I got it figured out, I couldn't seem to get it in tune so that it was lean enough that I could get it to launch hard off the line without being so lean at part throttle that it caused me a lot of high CHT, cylinder head temperatures, and eventually caused the edges of the piston crown to melt and for my piston ring to seize in the piston. So as it stood at the end of the last video, I couldn't get the carburetor totally in tune the way I wanted it, and I had an engine that was apart because of an engine failure due to being lean at part throttle. I cleaned the cylinder thoroughly and then took precision measurements with a dial bore gauge, and what I found was that this cylinder has worn about 0.005 to 0.01 millimeters from when it was brand new. This cylinder came to me as a B cylinder with a B piston. So usually you'll get A, B, C, or D pistons. And at least I know with TPR you can get A and B cylinders. I'm not sure if they go any further. And every step up from A to B, B to C, etc. should be roughly 0.01 millimeters larger in diameter. So after seeing that wear, I wanted to get a C piston to move up 0.01 millimeters in diameter, and I thought that that should put me pretty close to my initial or original clearances with this engine if I could just get a hold of a C piston. However, that turned out to be much more difficult than I thought, and that's why this has been 3+ months since I've worked on this thing, because that's how long basically that I have spent waiting to get a hold of a C piston. Fast forward a few months and I do finally have a new C piston, which I've already measured, and it is indeed, by my measurements, 0.0004 inches or 0.01 millimeters larger than the B piston that I had last time. And when I plug that into the information from the cylinder, that does indeed put my clearances pretty much where they were when the cylinder was brand new. So now all I've got to do, I've got everything cleaned up already. I've just got to reassemble the top end of the engine. I'm going to give the RTV on the base gasket some time to set up before I do any pressure or leak test. So in the meantime, I want to take care of something else, which is the other fail at the end of the last video, and that's the water pump. So the water pump didn't actually fail, it still worked. However, I noticed that this bearing in the end of it will move in and out of the housing, and that shouldn't happen. So the housing's worn down because I had just done a rebuild with new bearings not that long ago. And when you look up the price of the bearings and the impeller shaft and so on to do a rebuild, it doesn't really make any sense to rebuild these, especially now seeing that the housing is wearing out anyway. So I went ahead and picked up 2 new cart pumps just because it saves on shipping to buy 2 at a time. And I also picked up another pulley for that. This is the pulley that I've been using on the water pump, and this is the one that I bought to replace it, or perhaps replace it. So this is a 30-tooth pulley, and this is a 32-tooth pulley, just slightly larger. I've got a 12-tooth pulley on the crank, so that gives me a 40% drive ratio using this, which means if I'm assuming that I have a 2,000 to 14,000 RPM range for the engine RPM, this will be driven at between 800 and 5,600 RPM. Switching to this would be a 37.5% drive ratio, so it would drive the pump just a little bit slower, and it would have a 750 to 5,250 RPM range if the engine's going at the same RPM as it was with this pulley. So not a whole lot of difference, but maybe it would free up some tiny fraction of a horsepower or just reduce the wear of the pump slightly. So I'm going to see if I can get that to fit. I don't know if I can. I've got a 160 and a 180 belt here. I thought I had a 170. 160 is what I was using. That's the length of these XL belts. And I thought maybe just moving up this much I could use a 170, but apparently I didn't check and I've only got a 180. That's probably going to be too long. So we'll just have to see how it works out. But the first thing I've got to do is swap this onto here. Well, it definitely doesn't need the 180, because that's how that fits. It would have to be way out here, and I'm definitely not trying to build another bracket right now, so no go on the 180. Don't have the 170. 160 looks like it might be close. Maybe it could work, but I think it's probably going to be too tight. And they don't make, to my knowledge, 165 or anything like that. So I guess I'm going to take this pulley off, and I'll just go back to the 30-tooth. As you saw, the engine passed the leak test, and now I've got the exhaust installed, and it should basically be ready to go back in. But it's not going in until later today, or at least I hope later today, because my jack stands that I normally put underneath of the foot pegs on this thing, and that keeps it well supported while I've got the engine out and makes it easy to remove and install the engine, are now tied up with my T-Max and probably going to be there for a while. So I ordered a pair of 2-ton jack stands, small jack stands, that should be good for this. And after what happened when I was trying to take this out of the scooter, I'm definitely not trying to put the engine back in until I get those, because it's been a while since I've removed an engine without just having this on jack stands. And long story short, I almost dropped the scooter off of the bench onto the hood of the Mustang that is normally parked beside it, and then almost dropped the engine off of the bench at the same time. So yeah, I'm not doing that again. I'll wait for those jack stands. But in the meantime, I've got some work to do to the carburetor, because it wouldn't do a whole lot of good to replace a piston that was melted on the edges or burnt up on the edges from a lean metering rod, or at least that's my belief, lean carburetor settings, and then put the carburetor back in the exact same way that it was. Shortly after the engine failure happened months ago, I went on Lectron's site and looked up metering rod information, and here's the metering rod chart that I found. Unfortunately, I can't say that I can make total sense out of this chart. I can to some degree, but I'm not exactly sure what I'm looking at or how big of a change I would get as you progress through the chart. So I sent Lectron an email, and I tried to somewhat briefly go over what my setup was, what the carburetor had in it, what I've tried, and what I've been experiencing. Thankfully, the brief response that I got from Lectron did include a recommendation for a metering rod, which they said they would recommend a 4.2 for my setup, and that it would come with its own initial setting. So the length of the metering rod that I should set it at to begin with. So I went ahead and ordered a metering rod. When I got the metering rod, I saved the box because I wanted you to see exactly why they have to charge $16 to ship something as small as a metering rod. So when you open the box, here is the metering rod stapled to the underside of one of the top flaps. Then I've got a receipt and a free t-shirt promo. Below that, there's literally nothing other than a big ball of packing. You probably think that I almost dropped T2 in the floor just there, but that's not how this went at all. T2 saw these jack stands and thought they were for a 4-stroke, and he was going to jump right off the scooter bench. I would never do that though. See, these are 2-stroke specific jack stands. To remove the metering rod, I'm just going to use my metering rod tool and rotate the metering rod counterclockwise like I'm unscrewing it until it unscrews all the way out of the slide. Just looking at the 4.2 and the 2.2 metering rods side by side, I can't tell a whole lot of difference. However, since I had them out, I went ahead and took a bunch of measurements of them. That way I could easily tell what was happening here. So the first thing that I realized that they are both essentially the same length. A slight difference, but I think that may be the rounded off ends. Then I realized also that the threaded sections are the same length and the non-threaded sections where there is a taper ground into the flat side are the same length. So, at least to me and my less than 100% accurate measurements, it appears that the length is not something that they change, at least not with a 4.2 and the 2.2. However, when you look at these on the sides, you can see that they do taper down. So they start at the same diameter right up here below the threads, which is just shy of 1/8 of an inch by my measurement. And then they actually end at the very end, the smallest point I can measure, at almost the same measurements. But I think that's just the ground section. I'm measuring the very, very ends where they're ground down. And I marked these at 517 thousandths of an inch per step because that's a quarter of the total length from the end of the threads to the end of the metering rod. And looking at those measurements, you can actually see a difference, and you can tell that there is a taper difference between the two. The 4.2 runs a little bit more narrow than the 2.2 does. So there's a bit more of an angle on the taper of the 4.2 than the 2.2 metering rod. So if both of these metering rods were installed at exactly the same height, the 4.2, since it is thinner, should deliver a little bit more fuel. However, they have specified that the 4.2 should be screwed out further, so it's got a longer length than the 2.2 was initially, so it should be a bit leaner that way. So I'll get this thing back together and we'll see how it works out. To install the metering rod, I'm just going to try to screw it in there to begin with until I see most of the threads disappear. I've got my caliper locked in at 2 56 thousandths of an inch, so I'll just keep adjusting this until it matches up with my caliper's reading. That appears to be right on to me. So now my metering rod's set, I can go ahead and reinstall this. It should be almost ready to run, but I still have to put coolant of some sort in there. I'm actually going to use a radiator flush and cleaner for now with just plain water because the stuff that's been coming out of there was so nasty. I want to try and clean it out if I can before I put any regular coolant back into it. The screeching sound that you heard after I got the scooter started was coming from the kickstart, so I took it apart and checked it out and found that this shaft can move in and out about 35 to 40 thousandths of an inch, and when it moves inward it pushes up against the rotating parts on the engine, so that's why it screeches. There's so much stuff like that that can make these Chinese engines less than fun to work with, because if you're not paying total attention and inspecting everything as if it could be wrong, then that kind of stuff pops up. So anyway, I took this, checked it out, it's 40 thousandths of an inch thick. So I found a washer I had around that's about 75 thousandths of an inch thick, but the inside diameter was too small, so I just bored that out on the mini lathe real quick. And then I can install it instead. I'm just going to do a mock-up without the spring real quick. And that takes most of the slop out of it. It's still got a little bit of play there, but not a whole lot. That felt really good. Maybe not so much in the everything's in tune sense, but more in I haven't ridden this two-stroke in 3.5 to 4 months sense. So it just felt nice to be on there. I haven't ridden anything a whole lot lately, but definitely always miss my two-stroke when it's not running. So I could tell just on that ride that wide open throttle's not right, because it runs stronger at 3/4 throttle than it does at wide open throttle, so it'll certainly need some power jet adjustment in the future. I have no idea about the metering rod yet because I really haven't stopped and tried to take off, but it didn't feel too bad for just an initial setting. So right now the goal with that ride was just to get it nice and warm, and now I'll let it cool off for a while, and then I'll retorque the cylinder head nuts, and after that I can actually get into some tuning. I don't think this is going to get far because it looks like it's about to rain, but let's see if I can at least get a couple test passes in. There's a little bit of bog or hesitation there, and I think it's probably still running lean part throttle because I was seeing over 200 degrees with just holding part throttle a little bit. That's at a little bit higher part throttle, say maybe around mid-range or a little lower. So I'm going to see if I can get away with turning the metering rod in a little bit to make it shorter and richen it up. I didn't bring my calipers. I like to measure it every time, so I'm just going to do one adjustment before I go home, and I'll have to measure when I go home and see how much I did move it. This new 4-2 metering rod really doesn't seem to be getting me anywhere. So again, I was running lean at part throttle on the way to this test spot. Got to the test spot, it seems like it's probably a little bit rich when I'm taking off. You've seen the times, it's slower than it was. So I richened it up, even figuring that it was going to get too rich for launch. And sure enough, it did act a little bit worse on launch and everything slowed down. However, even with richening up a little bit, it still ran lean at part throttle. So I'm too rich to take off and too lean to cruise, which is exactly where I was before. I have contacted Lectron. I asked them if maybe they could recommend 1 or 2 metering rods for me because I'd really like to get this thing going. I'm kind of tired of messing with it already. But in the meantime, while I'm waiting for them, I'm thinking about modifying one of the metering rods that I have. To be honest, I'm not exactly sure what I should do at this point, but what I'm thinking about, if you look at this diagram that I made earlier, so D to H here is the actual length or thickness that matters. D on this end would be toward idle, and this would be toward wide open. I'm thinking to leave roughly D to E, this area, alone, and hopefully that keeps the idle lean enough that it gives me less trouble taking off. And I know that if I'm at very low throttle, at slow speeds, it's not really a problem. It seems to do okay there. But anytime I'm giving it much throttle at all, trying to do part throttle to cruise around, it's very lean and it gets hot. So I'm assuming E to G roughly in this area. I should try to take some material out and thin it out there. Possibly even a little bit between G and H down to the very bottom there of the metering rod. These metering rods have a precision ground flat edge on just one side, and I assume that you want to be careful to try and preserve at least the angle there. So you wouldn't want, say, one area aiming this way, the flat spot's aiming over here, and then another area, the flat spot's aiming over here. That wouldn't be good. You want to try to keep that as true as possible. As long as it's not very, very sensitive to that being exactly flat and true all the way across, then I would think probably one of the toughest parts would be just getting the measurement that you're after, because changes of thousandths of an inch make a huge difference. I wrap masking tape just around the end where the threads are so I can hold it in the vise, and then I've marked the section that I want to concentrate on the most with some permanent marker. I've got this thinned out as much as I want to go, possibly more than I wanted to go, but it does have some markings from the sanding tool. I'm going to go over it with a little bit finer pad there and just see if I can smooth it out slightly. I've updated this graphic to show you the modified 2-2 needle that I just sanded. So you can see that nothing changed from A to D. That's all been left alone. But when you look at E through H, starting on the bottom, H now matches up to where the 4-2 metering rod is. And then when you look at F and G, they are considerably more rich or thinner than either one of the other needles. And then E is closer to the 4-2. This could end up being way too much fuel at part throttle, but I think it's worth a shot. At least if this goes wrong, I think it should be going wrong in the right way, so to speak, meaning I'm just putting too much fuel in there. So having too much fuel shouldn't burn a piston. I should just have drivability issues, which I'd take that over engine damage any day.
Alright, I looked it up and I found that 2 40/1000 was the best setting with a 2.2 before. That gave me a clean launch and really lean part throttle. I already had to turn the idle up because I think it's so rich and it chugs a lot of smoke. A little more than normal. So I probably just ruined this metering rod, but let's go find out. Oh yeah. Yeah, it's done. And while I'm at it with bad news, you can see there's some water on the floor. That is because my coolant tank looked like it was about to overflow, so I opened the coolant tank in this, and then water flowed out of there. And I thought, well, maybe just that radiator flush, for some reason it foamed or something. That doesn't seem right, but hey, try to be optimistic. But all this was just empty, and now I've got coolant up to about here and there again. So on top of everything else, I think it has probably blown some sort of head seal.
Checking out the top of the cylinder, pretty much what I always get when I take these apart is what you see down here, and there isn't much evidence of the O-ring that seals around the bore in this particular section. I normally have that evidence right up here, although it seems to be kind of smeared out on the very top of the cylinder as well. Other than that, I don't see anything that looks a whole lot different. I was looking at these O-rings that go around the studs, and I don't see any damage to them. Looking at the cylinder head itself, here you can see there's an awful lot of that O-ring material that's been pushed out away from the bore. And then up here, it looks like the O-ring is really flattened out, like it was damaged or burned or something. It may have been pinched, I don't know, it could have got pinched maybe on the edge of that wall. Hard to say, but I also notice when I flip this over, you can see a lot of that O-ring material that has left kind of a ragged edge. So there's been some kind of damage to the O-ring, and over here it's clearly misshapen. So it looks to me like this O-ring failed. As of now, I'm about 10 days before the May car show that I always try to attend on the scooter, and I actually believe that Ryan from Pennsylvania is going to try to come down and ride with me. So I really want to make it to that, and I'm not sure if this is going to continue to keep blowing out seals or what's going to happen with this. This one has been modified some time ago. It cracked the section between that bore and the bore for the cylinder or combustion O-ring. So I put little aluminum inserts on there, and it's been modified that way, but also this has been cut down. I think it was about 0.2 to 0.25 millimeters to tighten up the squish a little bit, because so far I haven't put any of these TPR cylinders together and had them come out to the actual TPR spec. So I tightened it up a little bit. But that also takes some material off of the O-ring area, and I think I've also subjected this head to more stress. I talked about this in a previous video, but I used to always use oil on the cylinder studs when I torque the head down, and it was brought to my attention that I shouldn't be using oil, and that's probably over torquing them. And when I looked it up, it does over torque them quite a bit, with the difference between oil and dry. So I've since switched to a lower torque spec and no oil. But before that, I could have been causing stress to this head because of the way I was torquing them down. So, as you can see, I happen to have a brand new head here, the inner and the outer portions of a brand new head. I don't really need the outer portion, but since I've got them, I think I'm going to go ahead and switch over to this and just have something fresh that's unmodified. Unfortunately, most likely that's going to mean that my squish clearance is a couple tenths of a millimeter larger than it was with this, but I think that's a reasonable sacrifice in order to be able to try to make it to a car show, because I really don't want to miss that. That's my favorite thing of the entire year. So I'm going to plan to go ahead with this, and that'll also switch me back to the normal O-rings in here. I have had to use smaller O-rings because of the way this is modified, so I'll be able to use the regular TPR O-rings that are slightly thicker and larger, and maybe that'll do the trick. Minimum clearance on those checks was 1.09 millimeters, and it was pretty much the same everywhere, ranging from about 1.09 to 1.11 for the minimum. For me personally, I don't mind an aggressive exhaust that's fairly loud, but unfortunately I know that other people aren't big fans of it, and it draws a lot of attention. And with all the cracking down they've been doing, and even I've seen a couple of scooters that didn't look like they had much as far as modifications impounded at one of the car shows, I figure it wouldn't be a bad idea if I could quiet it down at least just a little bit. So what I did is I went on to scootertuning.ca. As always, they hooked me up with a bit of a discount to help me out and keep me making videos. So big thanks to those guys. And also, I know I can count on them to get me parts very quickly. So I went on there and I picked up a Yasuni silencer. This is an aluminum silencer. It's for a C16 and some other pipes. It's just the silencer and a gasket for that. And I also picked up the flange for it, though I don't know if it's going to do me a whole lot of good. When you line these two up end to end down here, you can see that there's not a whole lot of difference in the total length. It's maybe a ½ inch or so if you're not counting the studs. However, Yasuni uses a bolt-on flange, so if you take that into account and realize that Malossi's flange is included in here, the Yasuni is a little bit longer. But when you look at that, the Yasuni does have quite a bit more silencer area. So from here to here is basically all actual silencer with the perforated tube and the stuffing. But when you look at this one, it only goes from about here to here. So Yasuni definitely has a little more area. The differences that are really going to matter are down here. So first off, the inside diameters, I measured the Yasuni at about 20.5 millimeters and the Malossi at about 21.5 millimeters. So the Malossi has about a 1 millimeter larger inside diameter. But if you look in there, even with the end cap snugged up, you can see that there's a gap between the end cap and the perforated tube of the silencer. So I would think if I open this up to match the Malossi, it should just allow a little more of the gas to go into the actual silencer packing. So I need to get this O-ring out of the end first, trying not to damage it. There we go. Before I put anything back together, I want to show you what I think is probably the reason that the Yasuni exhausts sound much more quiet than the Malossi pipes. So if you look in there, instead of the typical perforated tube where you've got just a bunch of holes in that center section, Yasuni actually has these long grooves in there, and that goes all the way through the pipe. So that lets a lot more gas exit through that center section instead of just pushing it out through the exhaust. I'm not having any luck trying to get a shot down the center of the Malossi exhaust right now, but here's a view of it when I was doing a repacking video. And you can see that it has much smaller holes all the way through it versus those very large grooves that the Yasuni has. Most likely, if you wanted to make your Malossi exhaust more quiet without spending a whole bunch of money, or any money perhaps, you could probably take this apart, unwrap all the packing material, and then just make some larger holes in that perforated tube, and it would probably quiet it down. These silencers are meant to mount in totally different manners. So the MHR, the Malossi silencer, slides on over there, and it's got O-rings inside of the silencer itself to seal against the stinger. With the Yasuni, you get this little adapter that bolts onto the silencer, but this is what actually interacts with the stinger, and what they do is their stinger comes out larger and then this slides inside of it. So there definitely need to be changes for how this is set up. Now look at the difference with the end with no O-ring, and then the end with an O-ring. So that seemed to work pretty well. Now I just want to do the same thing on the other side, so I've got 2 O-ring grooves in here. So now I've got both O-ring grooves cut in there. I don't have O-rings in it right now, but I'm realizing that I may have made a design flaw, or I'm pretty sure I did. So I cut this flange so that it will fit over the end of the stinger, and I also cut the end of the silencer so that it fits over the stinger. So there's absolutely nothing to stop this. The only thing that stops this is it has to basically go back and it'll be pulled against the exhaust there. So what I'm afraid of is if it's pulling against the exhaust all the time with spring tension, then it may just start wearing through the stinger back here. So I probably should actually have a stop. And I think the easiest way to have a stop right now would be if this plate didn't have such a large diameter hole there, and that actually acted as the stop instead of just going around there. Because initially I was thinking just fit this on there as deep as I can, but I don't think that's the smartest move. So I could either try to weld this up and then re-drill it, or just make this over again totally. I got the second one made, this time with a little bit smaller hole there. It actually turned out a bit better anyway. The first time I hand drilled, and then I ended up having to elongate the holes here a little bit for the studs. This time I actually put it in the drill press and did it right, so everything aligns the way it should. And that'll be a stop. It won't be able to go over that. Now what I'm noticing is it's going to be the same problem that I've got with the Malossi exhaust. So if you look at some of these areas on here, I've got these gouges in here because when this sits on here, the bolt is right up against the silencer and it'll vibrate against there, and yeah, it's not good. I put a spacer in there to try and push it out, but it kind of makes it always sit a little odd. It really seems like this should have just been at a slightly different angle in the first place. And again, this one appears that it would do the same thing. So what I'm thinking is, if I were to grind one end of this at a little bit of an angle, then maybe I can actually make it so instead of sitting right up against there, that it pushes out just a little bit. Before this actually goes on, I do need to cut down the outside diameter, because for one, I don't really need a pound of steel back there, but also as it sits, there's really not enough room to even install the nuts onto the studs, so I've got to thin that out a bit. This is probably a mistake because I know I could flux core weld this thing together just fine, but I've got to learn somehow, so I'm going to try to TIG weld it together. Yes, this is definitely a mistake. Well, I wanted to learn, but I think I'm going to switch over to the flux core, because I'm really just piling stuff up on here and starting to melt things, And it's not like it's going to be perfect. It's still going to be very ugly. Not great welds when I do it with flux core, but I've spent way too much time on this thing to ruin it trying to learn right now. So I think I need to practice on more parts that don't take many hours to put together. This should be pretty much a finished piece. So you can see I've got both O-rings installed inside. I've had to grind a bit away on each edge here so the nuts can actually fit down there because the welds were sticking out too much. And I trued this up, sanded it against sandpaper on glass a little bit. But I believe that should work now. This bracket for the Malossi silencer is a little bit too large for the Yasuni silencer. I could close it all the way up and it still wouldn't grab that really tightly. So I had some 1/8" rubber. It's sticky on one side, and I just stuck that in there and then went around and trimmed everything with an X-Acto knife. So now this fits, it's able to fit nice and snug, and it's got a little bit of padding on there. So with that said, I should be able to try and actually mount this to the rest of the pipe. This thing really doesn't feel like it's going anywhere right now, but obviously we still want to install the spring if possible. Yeah, that's way too short. Okay, let's see if I got anything else. I had this one around for the piece pipe, so maybe it'll work on here. There we go. For the most part it looks okay, but that's not going to end well. The silencer sits right up against that bracket and there's no clearance whatsoever. It's actually kind of pushed into it, so I'm sure if those are left that way they will wear into each other. Most likely the silencer is going to end up getting worn out right there in that corner. So I guess the easy solution will be, hopefully, to see if I can just add some spacing to the silencer mount. There's not a whole lot of room there, but maybe 100,000ths of an inch or so, a little less than 1/8 of an inch. If I do need more space at some point, I'd have to get a longer bolt for the clamp mount and then just use a little bit more spacing back there and it should be fine. I've got a decibel meter set up here. It's just like I've done it for past tests with the MHR exhaust and other exhaust. It's 6 feet from the rear tire at a 45-degree angle. I certainly didn't expect these results because in person it sounds much more quiet with the Yasuni silencer than it did with the Malossi. The decibel readings just don't reflect that. So my best guess is that the pod filter is loud enough that it's causing the readings to be higher because everything else had an air box, but I'm not exactly sure what's going on. Regardless, I think anyone else would perceive the same thing that I do, and it seems way more quiet now.
I've got the 4.2 metering rod back in here, and I set it at 2 30,000ths, so a good bit richer, about 20,000ths richer than it was before, because I just want to get this thing down the road and do a warm-up ride so I can do my retorque. because when I went down the road earlier this morning for the warm-up ride so I could re-torque, it actually didn't run as bad as I thought, and it seemed like it had plenty of fuel, if not too much fuel in spots at some of the part throttle positions. So that was at 2 and 30 thousandths. Initially I was at 2 and 56 and 2 and 50, and that was too lean part throttle and too rich off the line. So I'm going to try 2 and 40 thousandths and just see how it does, just to make sure I'm not wrong. Stops me here. Come on, you can do it.
After a few brief email exchanges with Brooks from Lectron, I've now got 2 more metering rods here to try out. I've got a 6.0 and a 6.3. So what he said was, I have 2 theories. You either need a rod with a lot of fuel in the bottom and a lean starting point, example, a 6.3 at 2 and 70 thousandths, or a rod with very little fuel down low with a super aggressive taper set really richer, example 6.0 set at 1.940. And then he was kind enough to say that if I wanted to go ahead and order the 6.3 on their site, I could just give him the order number and then he would throw in a 6.0 or a 6.1. So I did that, and he indeed sent me a 6.0 at no charge. So thanks to Brooks Tomlin of Lectron Fuel Systems. As you can see, I've already measured these out and put that info on the screen for you. So now I just need to decide where to start. And it seems like the 6.3 is the first suggestion, so I'm just going to go with that. The only discrepancy here is he says to set it at 2 and 70 thousandths, and the receipt says 2 and 84 thousandths, but I guess I'll just go with his recommendation.
Too rich, it's going to have to be leaned out for rideability anyway, but just curious to see if it does anything off the line. Just bogs like crazy. Not even going to give that one a 2-run average because it's just obvious. I'm going to go ahead and set this thing back to 2 and 84 thousandths, which was the recommendation on the receipt, and just see how that changes it. Well, that's more like 2 and 83 thousandths, but that's going to have to be close enough.
I won't know what the acceleration times are until I go inside later and check those out, but I do know that it's not right. The first pass I only made 1 pass because it was clearly off, and then on the second you could still hear it breaking up, so it's definitely not correct. I need to change something. It could be that this metering rod will work with more adjustment, but I know it's got a lot of fuel somewhere near wide open throttle, say roughly 3/4 throttle. It starts to try to die if I just hold it there. So it's got way too much fuel in that area. Down lower in the throttle, it actually feels fairly close. I won't say that it's spot on, but it's at least close in that range. So again, I'm fearing that if I lean it out enough to get a stronger launch and to make that near wide open throttle work a little better, then I'm probably going to lean it out too much on the bottom end. So since I've got the 6.0 metering rod around, I'm going to go ahead and install that and see how that does.
Better than my modified 2.2. At least I can get it to move, but not very well. That was so far out that I took a swing at it and moved it to 1 in 960 thousandths, so 40 thousandths toward lean. Well, that's much better already.
After looking everything over, I think if any of the metering rods that I have are going to work, it's probably going to be the 6-3. But that's going to depend if I can get that basically unusable section right around 3/4 throttle out of there. So I don't think I'm going to do it with the metering rod adjustment itself, because I'm going to get way too lean if I'm trying to back that much fuel out of it. So I'm starting to wonder if, because it's at 3/4 throttle or somewhere in that range, very near wide open throttle, perhaps the pilot jet is starting to have an effect there, and with the metering rod and the pilot jet, it's just too much. I reinstalled the 6-3 metering rod and set it at 2 83 thousandths of an inch, and now I'm going to turn the power jet 1 turn in. So it was at 3 turns out, now I'm going to move it to 2 turns out. Definite improvement. It didn't make 3/4 totally try to die, so I'm going to go ahead another half turn in. But it obviously still needs help, because on that acceleration run it was not doing very well when I was holding it wide open throttle. Turn in, that'll be 1 turn out. Got so much of that fog in there though. I can't even do a wheelie right now. I took one more ride with a 6-3 metering rod because I'm really trying to give this thing a chance. I realized that I did skip from 3 to 2 turns out on the power jet, so I thought I might as well try 2.5 turns out. That didn't do anything for me. And I also tried going even leaner on the power jet, so I tried a half turn out and 0 turns out, and that didn't do it either. So I think the 6 metering rod is just delivering too much fuel near wide open throttle, and I probably need something like a 4 or a 5 series rod in there. I also thought about trying to set the 6-3 rod a little bit more lean and see if I could get away with that, but on the last test ride I realized that at half throttle it starts heating up pretty quickly, and I hear spark knock and the CHT starts going up. So even that is still lean at about half throttle, so I don't think I need to lean it out anymore. I'm just asking for trouble, and I really don't want to take another piston out. I think I'm done with Lectron for right now, because it's currently Tuesday afternoon, and I have to have this scooter ready by Friday morning at the latest. I'd really like it ready before then. But I definitely don't have time to order any more metering rods, because by the time I get an email out, place an order, wait for the order, etc., I don't want to pay for overnight. So it's just not going to work out. And even if I did get the rods here, who knows if they're going to be right this time either. So I think I'm just going to go back to the Dell'Orto PHBL 25mm carb that was working before and hope that it works again. The Dell'Orto carburetor is definitely staying on here for the show because I just took it out of the packaging that I had it stored in, installed it, and it runs great. However, I do want to go over a little bit of a summary of where I've been so far with the Lectron tuning. So as you can see, I got my best results for acceleration with the 2-2 metering rod at around 2 36/thousandths of an inch. And the power jet was 5.5 turns out. It worked pretty well between 5 1/4 and 5 3/4 turns out at that point. But the problem is, it would still give me a rich stutter at cruise, and it was very, very lean part throttle to the point that it ruined a piston, so that's really no good. Then moving on to the 4-2 metering rod, I had a range of settings where I could get it to seem like it was probably okay for part throttle operation. However, it had a rich stutter anytime that I tried to use the throttle quickly, whether it was from a stop or from a roll. You can see that none of the other metering rods did as well as the 2-2 for acceleration runs, and I can't say that it's impossible that they would, but after seeing what happened with a 2-2 and burning a piston, I just tried to stay away. Once I realized that I was getting too lean for part throttle, then I kind of gave up on it and didn't try to lean the metering rod out anymore for safety. Moving on to the 6 series rods, the 6-3 and the 6-0, I think they were just delivering too much fuel on the top end. My best results with any of them were with the power jet between 0 and 1 turns out. I think more leaning toward 0 turns out. So that's really telling me that it's providing too much fuel on the top end, and both of those had a lot of problems with 3/4 throttle to make holding 3/4 throttle basically unusable. With the 6-3 metering rod set around 2 70 to 2 80 thousandths of an inch, it did pretty well at part throttle for the most part, but it still had a lean spot right around half throttle. And even at that, 3/4 throttle was still rich and stumbling. The 6-0 was basically very rich. I didn't do a whole lot of testing with that. I didn't even try to turn the power jet in because it seemed pretty far off for my needs. I really think the 6 series of metering rods have too much fuel. Judging by the fact that the power jet was around 5.5 turns out for the 2-2, I don't think that was enough fuel. So probably a 4 or a 5 series metering rod would work for my fueling needs on the top end. However, I'm not exactly sure which second number I should go with if I wanted to improve part throttle. So I don't know if maybe I should use a 4-1, a 4-3, a 5-3, etc. It seems like we're getting closer to something that's going to be in tune, but on the other hand, it still seems pretty far away. Just for an example, check these times out. So you can see my best times with the 2-2 metering rod were 3.4, 5.1, and 7.7. However, just swapping that Del Orto back on there with no tuning since I took it off months ago, it did 3.4, 5.0, and 7.4. It definitely runs harder on the top end, and it definitely performs better on quick throttle. And you can see that that's not even the best times that I've got out of the Del Orto carburetor. So far, I haven't been able to see any improvement in horsepower that's obvious to me, or any improvement in throttle response. In fact, I would say I've seen the opposite in both cases. Fuel economy, maybe. I mean, when it was so lean that it was burning pistons, I'm sure it wasn't eating up much fuel. But again, that's pretty useless information at this point. One thing that I definitely haven't seen is all of the advertising about bolt it on and go. Yes, I could bolt this carburetor on and ride it around, but no, it was nowhere near in tune when I bolted it on. So I think that's probably partially because I have a custom application. This is a scooter with a bunch of modifications, and I just get the feeling that there's probably not a whole lot of R&D going on over at Lectron about scooter racing. I think it looks to me like they mostly focus for the two-stroke side on dirt bikes. Something else that could be a problem is that I'm using a pod filter instead of an air box. I'm a fan of air boxes on two-strokes. I think they work very well. They quiet it down. They make it easier to live with because they don't change so much over time when you're using an air box versus a pod filter. However, with traditional carburetors, there's no reason that I can't get one in tune with a pod filter or an air box. So I don't know that that's totally to blame for what's happening here, or it may not even be a big part of what's going on. I'm really not sure what I want to do moving forward, because part of me says you spent this much time on it, you just have to know if it can be tuned properly so that you get everything all around working, and if when it's tuned that way there really is some benefit to the Lectron carburetor, or even just for the larger carburetor. Part of me says that's ridiculous. It's probably not going to get a whole lot better than it is. Obviously, I do think I can at least get it close to in tune with enough metering rods and other parts possibly, but this all costs money. And one of the big things about the Lectron is you don't have to buy jets, you don't have to buy a bunch of needles, you don't have to buy whatever. However, when you do have to buy metering rods, they're way more expensive than main jets, pilot jets, needles, atomizers, etc. So I don't really think it pays off there. And also, I just find the metering rod system slightly more confusing than trying to look at a needle chart or something like that. And also, main jets and pilot jets are very simple because the number goes up, it's a bigger jet, you know, not much to it. I'd like to have a larger carburetor around for bigger, badder setups in the future, even though I don't think it's going to benefit the TPR, but I could just sell the Lectron, and probably with the money I get out of that, hopefully if I get any kind of return on what I put out for it, I'd be able to buy a larger carburetor, a set of main jets, a set of pilot jets, and a collection of needles. As of now, I'm leaning toward contacting Lectron one more time, now that I've got more information that I feel is helping to narrow it down, and maybe they can actually get me a metering rod that works for me. But I can definitely tell you that I'm not willing to keep going and going and going, swapping out metering rod after metering rod, because it's too much money and it's too much time for a carburetor that's supposed to be bolt on and go. But leave me your comments in the comment section. Tell me what you think of the whole deal. Would you buy a Lectron after seeing this? Do you think I should continue working on it? Just let me know what you think about it. With that said, I'm going to wrap this video up. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed the video or find it helpful.